This week we're going to begin using virtual machines to do our lab assignments. A virtual machine is nothing more than a computer that is virtualized and lives inside a server, and what I've done is I've created a virtual machine for each one of you. In order to connect to your virtual machine and start the installation of Linux, you will need the VMware Server Console. To download the VMware Server Console software, you just need to go to Blackboard and click on the necessary software link and then download the application. Once you start the application, it will ask you for a host name, username, and a password. First, you will need to VPN into the UIS network to access the VMware server. The host name of this server is csc570e.uis.edu. And then the username and password are simply your UIS net ID and password. So I'm going to put that tlos1 for me and then my password, and then I hit OK. Once I do that, it should open the virtual machine that I have access to. If it doesn't do that for you, you can just go to File, Open, click on Browse, find your NetID folder, double click it, and then open the Red Hat Enterprise Linux 4 configuration file. And then you will be presented with a screen that shows your virtual machine configuration information. What I've done is for your virtual machines, I've given you 128 megabytes of RAM, 5 gigs of hard drive space, and 1 processor. Please don't change these settings, the memory, and especially the memory, because we have 20 students and we just have enough memory to use 128 per student. After the first week, I will take away the write access to this configuration file and you won't be able to change it. But the first week, you need to have write access because it's going to create a Ethernet address for your virtual machine, Ethernet connection, and it will also create a GUID for your virtual machine. So you will need to have write access. But after that, I will take it so that we don't run into any issues. So the first thing I want to do is disable the floppy because that uses up resources and we really don't need a floppy. So I'm going to click on the floppy and then I'm going to uncheck connect that power on. Then the second thing we want to do is for this week's lab, we're going to do an installation. So we need to boot from a CD-ROM image in order to start our installation and load the installation kernel. So just for this week, we're going to go here to the CD-ROM. We're going to click on use ISO image and click browse. Then we're going to look in the root. We're going to go to var. We're going to go to FTP. We're going to go to pub. We're going to go to, I messed up. We're going to go to Red Hat. We're going to go to 4 because we're installing Red Hat Enterprise 4. And we're going to go to images. And there you will find the boot.iso image. What I've done is I've created an FTP server where I have the installation files of Red Hat Enterprise 4, and one of the files that this includes is an ISO file which basically allows you to boot off of this and begin the installation of Red Hat. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. So now you can see here that the CD-ROM is that ISO file, and I'm going to go ahead and click start this virtual machine to begin the installation process. This is nothing more than just your computer starting up and booting from the CD-ROM. Same thing that would happen when you did that. So we're presented with this screen that says boot. So we're going to hit enter to start loading the kernel. If you want to go into full screen mode, you can do Control Alt Enter, and that will put you in full screen mode, which basically will make it look like you are at the console of a regular computer and you were installing from your own computer. To come out of that full screen mode, you can do Control Alt, and that will basically minimize it and make the window smaller. So you can go back and forth between those two. So right now we're presented with a screen that says to choose a language. So we're going to choose English as a language. Then what type of keyboard do you have? We want to choose US, hit OK. Then it's going to ask us, how do you want to install Linux? In our case, like I said, I've installed an FTP server with the mount point with the installation files for Red Hat Enterprise 4. And so we're going to do a network install. So we're going to choose FTP. Other options are from a local CD-ROM, if we had a CD-ROM with the install CD, the hard drive, if we had all the files in the hard drive, an NFS image, if we were sharing an NFS drive with the installation files over the network, or an HTTP server, if we had a web server with installation files. I have chosen to use FTP. We could have used easily either use NFS or HTTP, but we're going with FTP this time. So we need to click FTP and hit OK. Now the next step is since we're doing a network installation, you need to get an IP address. So what I've done is I've set up a DHCP server for you, and if you choose to use dynamic IP configuration, um, that will give you an IP address and all the necessary network information to connect to the network and start the installation process. Optionally, you could do this statically, but like I said, it's much easier to do it through the HTTP, which has already been set up. So choose the HTTP and click OK. It's going to go out there, query the DHCP server, and try to get an IP address. So we'll wait a few minutes for that. Okay, it got the IP address, and now it's trying to figure out what the host name is and the domain. It's querying the DNS server basically. So this should take a couple seconds, and we'll see what happens. Okay, it looks like it got all the parameters. So the next step is it says, well, I already got my IP address, I got my DNS information. Now you need to tell me where the FTP server is. So the FTP server in our case is CSC 570e.uis.edu, which is the same server that has our virtual machines and the one that we connected last week for the assignments. And the Red Hat Enterprise Linux directory is in pub/redhat/4. I'm gonna click. We don't want to use non-anonymous FTP because this FTP server is anonymous, so anybody can connect without a password or a username. So we'll hit OK. It's gonna retrieve the images and it's gonna begin basically the installation process. Since we're doing this over the network, most likely it will start this process in text mode. If we had a direct connection, if we were doing it from a CD, then it would do it graphical install. So it's going to run the Anaconda process, which is basically the install process for Red Hat Linux. So right now it looks like it's probing the video card and the monitor, and pretty soon it will bring us to the installation process. Okay, so it says welcome to Red Hat Linux. So we'll hit OK. First it's gonna search and see if we had any other installations. Since this is a brand new VMware virtual machine that we have, so it finds nothing. So it's asking us now if we want to, how do we want to partition it? We can auto partition it, where we let the install process basically see how much space we have and do that automatically for us, or we can do this ourselves manually. I always like to do it myself because then I have more control. I can tell it how big I want the partition. So I'm gonna choose disk Druid to do it manually, and it's gonna ask me to initialize this hard drive. So basically, it's just gonna erase everything that's on it. So I'm gonna tell it to yes, go ahead and initialize it, and then it's gonna bring me up to this screen where it says that I have about 5 gigs of free space, and how do I want to partition it. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do a new partition. This is going to be my boot partition. This is where my boot files for the operating system are going to be, and I'm going to call this boot/boot. The file system is going to be extended3 type, and I'm going to make it 200 megs. Boot files are generally smaller. They include the boot kernel and other things, but they don't need to be that big, so 200 should be plenty. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. So now it should show us that we have a partition of about 196 megs. That's extended3, which is a file system type for Linux, and it's called /boot. The next thing we want to do is create our root partition and then create our swap partition, which is basically the secondary storage. So what we want to do is do another new partition. Um, let's see. Let me first check and see how much we have left. So we use 200 and it tells us that we have 449.18 free. So I'm gonna make the root partition 4 gigs and then 918 I'm gonna use for swap space. So I'm gonna do new. I'm gonna make this one the slash or the root partition. It's gonna be extended 3 and the size is gonna be 4000 megs or 4 gigs. Okay, so now we are left with 917 megabytes free, which is going to be a new partition. This one doesn't need a mount point because it's swap. So we're going to go down to swap and 917 and fill all available space. So we wanted to fill everything that's left for swap. Okay. So again, we have one partition that's 196 megs for boot. We have a 4 gig partition for the root and everything else, and then a 917 megabyte partition for swap. So since we only have 128 megabytes of RAM, if we ran out of RAM, we could use this swap space. And normally they tell you to do about twice the amount of RAM that you have, but in our case, we're kind of low on RAM because we all have to share this VMware host. So I'm making the swap space a little bigger. So I'm gonna hit OK. And it's gonna ask us what bootloader do we want to use. We're gonna go ahead and use Grub as the bootloader. If we had multiple operating systems, Grub would show us the different operating systems and will allow us to boot from Windows or Linux or whichever other one we had. So we're gonna go ahead and hit the default, which is use Grub. Here it's asking us if we need to pass any kernel options, which we don't, so we're just gonna hit OK. Here it's asking us if we want to put a password for the bootloader. In our case we don't, so we're just gonna hit OK. Here it basically shows the boot label as Red Hat Enterprise AS, and it's installed under dev SDA2. In Linux, the disk devices are always under /dev, and in the case of our virtual machines, the actual disks are SCSI disks. So SCSI disks in Linux are usually SD, and then the first one would be A, and then B and C. So here we just have one disk, so it's SDA, and then we have multiple partitions under that disk, so they start with 1, 2, 3, 4. So the root partition here is under SDA2, which was the second partition we created. So we're gonna hit OK. We're OK with that. Here it's going to tell us that it's going to put the bootloader is going to reside on the master boot record, and we're okay with that. And here it's configuring our Ethernet device. In Linux, the Ethernet device, the first network card that you have is usually ETH0, and then if you have other network cards, then you would have ETH1, 2, and so forth. So we're gonna tell it that our ETH0 or our only network card is gonna be configured using DHCP, and it's gonna be activated on boot. If we wanted to do this manually and put an IP, we could too, but since we have a DHCP server, we're gonna choose DHCP. And we're gonna tell it to automatically get the host name from DHCP. And here it's asking us if we want to put a firewall. In our case, I don't want a firewall because we are already inside a firewall. Later on, for one of our labs, we'll play with Linux firewalls, but in this case, we won't. So it's going to be no firewall. Here it's warning us that we've chosen no firewall and this is dangerous, but we're going to go ahead and proceed anyway. Now here it's asking us if we want to activate security enhanced Linux, which is another layer of security that has been put into Red Hat Enterprise 4. But in this case, I'm going to disable it. I don't want to add that extra layer of security. We will play with SE Linux later on, but right now, like just like the firewall, we're going to disable it to make things easier. Okay, language support, we're going to do English support, but if you wanted to use other languages, you certainly could. The time zone, by default, it picks Eastern time, so we're going to go up and find Chicago. Chicago, click OK. And then here it's going to ask us for the root password. This is the root super user password, and make sure you create a password that you can remember. So I'm going to put mine, hit OK. And now the next step is going to ask you what packages do you want to install. Um, the Red Hat installation, this comes with a lot of packages, so here you get to pick which software pieces you want to install on this server. So we're going to go ahead and just select a few software packages and then begin the installation process. So we'll wait for the screen to load. Okay. Here it's telling us, do you want to just install the recommended package selection, or do you want to customize what packages you want to install? In our case, we want to customize it, so we want to choose which ones we want. So I'm going to hit customize and hit OK. And then I'm just going to choose some things here. I want X Windows. For my environment, I like Genome better than KDE, so I'm going to choose Genome. I want editors. I want graphical internet, so we get Firefox. I also want text-based internet. I don't want Office. I don't want sound or games. I want configuration tools. I want a web server. I want to be able to share files with the Windows server, so I'm going to do Windows file server. And then I do want, let's see, development tools so that we can compile things later on that we may have to. I want legacy software development. I want administrative and system tools. And I want system printing support. So then I'm going to hit OK. And once I do that, it's going to check for dependencies. And it's going to tell me that a complete log of this installation is going to be found under root/install.log. After rebooting the system, we can look at that file and see what happened with the installation. And the first thing after that is going to format the hard drive with the partitions that we asked it to, and then it's going to install Linux, and then it's going to ask you to reboot. Once you reboot, you will have a fresh copy of Linux. For your assignment this week, I will give you, you will basically have to install the same way I have done here, the Red Hat Linux 4, but I will give you different settings to pick to make it a little more customized than what I have done. So that's it for this one.